Welcome to the latest episode of the EastFlank Podcast. After previous episodes focused on defense and security, today we are turning to economics and one of the most important EU policies for Central and Eastern Europe, which is EU cohesion policy. This topic is especially relevant for countries on NATO's eastern flank, as many of them have been among the largest beneficiaries of EU cohesion funds since joining the European Union. It is also highly timely as discussions are already underway on the EU's next multi-annual financial framework and the future shape of cohesion policy after 2027. Today's discussion builds on a collaborative article produced by journalists from 9 countries across NATO's eastern flank. You can find a link to the article in the descriptions of this podcast. And joining me today are Filips Lastovskis from the Latvian news outlet Delphi and Polish journalist Alexandra Krzysztoszek from Focus Europe in Poland. My name is Marian Koreň and I am a journalist with the Slovak outlet EU Brief. In our article, we analyzed what more than 20 years of cohesion policy have delivered in the new or so-called new member states. Today we will focus on 3 countries that joined the European Union in 2004, Poland, Latvia and Slovakia. And after more than 2 decades, we have enough experience to ask a simple but important question. Has cohesion policy achieved its main goal of reducing economic and social disparities between EU countries and regions? Based on findings of our article, the short answer would be that the results are mixed. However, the full picture each is much more nuanced. So let's break it down in more detail. And let's start with a positive example, Poland. Poland is often presented as one of the greatest success stories of EU enlargement and cohesion policy, mainly in economic terms. So, Alexandra, do you agree? And when you look at Poland's economic transformation over the last 2 decades, what do you see as the key drivers behind this success? And how important has EU cohesion policy been in that process?
Well, I agree that Poland is often being presented as the key success story of cohesion policy, with a major part of EU funds being spent indeed well and contributing to the economic development of the country. And this economic growth that you mentioned, it came from a few things working together, actually. First, the EU membership gave Poland access to the single market, so trade and export really picked up. And at the same time, Poland became attractive for foreign investment, and mainly because of lower costs and a strong, relatively well-educated workforce, which was essential. And overall, the economy was fairly stable, which also helped a lot. But the EU cohesion policy wasn't the only driver. It wasn't, but it definitely played a big supporting role. And the most visible effects are in infrastructure. For instance, roads and highways that have improved massively. Also, railways and local transport has been modernized a lot. Another big area is the environment, including better waste management, wastewater treatment, cleaner infrastructure. And you can also see it in towns and cities, like renovated public spaces, new local investment, and so on and so forth. Also, healthcare and social areas are a bit more mixed, but still there are a room for improvement in these areas, like hospital upgrades and digital public services. They still need improvement, but they are in a better state than they used to be. As for awareness, people in Poland definitely see the change around them. They notice that they have better roads, the new infrastructure, and so on, but they don't always connect it directly to EU funds, even if we have plaques and labels everywhere stating that this or that was co-financed with EU funds. People do not always notice those labels, or they are not fully aware of the investment being financed with the EU money. So most people would say that the money from Brussels mattered, but it's usually seen as just one part of quite a bigger story, I would say.
Well, here in Slovakia, seeing Poland's story, I have to admit that many Slovaks feel a certain sense of envy. It is true that Slovakia experienced as well a dramatic increase in economic performance after joining the European Union. However, for several years now, Slovakia has either stopped converging towards the European average in terms of GDP per capita, or in some years has even fallen further behind. But the picture is even worse when we take a look at the individual regions. For example, if we look at the Eastern Slovakia, in 2026, it remains at around 50% of the EU average GDP per capita. This creates a paradox. The least visible results of cohesion policy can be found precisely in the poorest regions of Eastern Slovakia, which is also a region that received the largest share of European funding over the years. Of course, lagging of this region has many structural and systemic reasons, but if the main objective of cohesion policy is to reduce regional disparities, then at least on paper that objective is not being achieved. And just to put things into perspective, Slovakia has received roughly 25 billion euros from cohesion policy since joining the EU. But rather than speaking only on aggregate and maybe abstract numbers, let me illustrate this challenge with one concrete example, which is marginalized Roma communities. In Slovakia, for many years, Slovakia has invested substantial amounts of cohesion policy funding into improving living conditions and opportunities for these communities. But yet there is very hard to find any visible results. Many people in these communities still live in extremely poor conditions, even without adequate access to clean water, canalization, quality education or healthcare, and with very limited opportunities in the labor market. Over the times, marginalized Roma communities have become in many ways a symbol of the shortcomings or even failure of cohesion policy in Slovakia, and that is why also it attracted attention at the European level. Representatives of the European Commission and the European Parliament regularly visit these communities, and their reaction is often the same: surprise, concern, even shock, and the feeling that after so many years of investment, the situation should look very different. Of course, EU funds have brought visible improvements in Slovakia as well. We can see them in modernized roads, public transport in cities, environmental structure, schools, and etc. So very similar picture to Poland. But I think it's fair to say that there is a broad consensus among experts, stakeholders, and many Slovaks that the country failed to make the most of the opportunities provided by already 3 programming periods of EU cohesion policy. And many believe it is actually wasted opportunity. So, Philips, we have already heard 2 rather different stories, one largely seen as maybe more successful and another that has produced a more mixed results, diplomatically speaking. So where would you place Latvia on that spectrum? And has cohesion policy delivered the kind of transformation that citizens and experts expected?
I would place us somewhere in the middle. Since the 2004, we see, of course, enormous economical growth due to the EU funds and cohesion policy. But for example, I can say that Latvians would see cohesion policy as some kind of success story because they just don't know mostly what this term means. It is still a very technocratic and bureaucratic term, and it's something far away. But if you are mentioning for EU funds, then you start to connect the dots that, okay, this road maybe to my school in region got better because I saw that plate that the EU funds does something. But in real life, most likely it is there is a small percentage of people that thinks like that because we have our own everyday routines or hardships, and we are trying to survive our days and weeks. And even if the road or school is better, how realistically you think also that people sits and thinks, oh, great, the European Union did that. Now I will be closer to it. There I would be skeptical, but still it translates maybe in another way. When you ask for Latvians, and it is for constantly in many surveys, attitude against European Union, it is always generally positive. And of course, those practical things that we see in our everyday life, it's the realization of that survey results, because we see that life gets better and it helps, but it maybe is not so specific and directed as cohesion fund or EU funds directly.
Oh, thank you. So in many ways, the situation is very similar in Slovakia, I have to say. And when it comes to missed opportunities, and now I'm going to speak about Slovak case. For example, we have been asking ourselves the same questions for years. How is it possible that despite the billions of euros coming into the country, results are still falling short of what Slovak citizens and the European Union would reasonably expect? And as a journalist, I have to say that I have attended dozens of debates, workshops, and conferences on cohesion policy. And I have to say that the explanations tend to be very consistent. The same problems are identified over and over again. There has been visible only little progress in addressing them. One of the most frequently mentioned reasons, and one that has been discussed for many years, is the absence of long-term national development strategy. So the state lacks a clear vision that would identify the country's strengths, weaknesses, and most pressing needs, both at national level and across individual regions. And as a result, strategic investment planning is largely missing. This has led to a situation where there are no clear investment priorities, so EU funds are used to finance for everything from benches in small villages, many digitalization projects, motorways, and so on. And while all of these projects may have their merits, spreading resources so widely inevitably limits their overall impact. The same goes here: when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And another major issue is the heavy bureaucracy and administrative burden associated with EU-funded projects. This is certainly not unique to Slovakia, but we often see cases of so-called gold plating, introducing requirements that go beyond what the EU rules actually demand. Public procurement is perhaps the most obvious example, but it is also linked to Slovakia's past experience with corruption scandals and clientelism involving European funds. And in response, additional layers of controls and regulations were introduced to prevent abuse. And all these safeguards are understandable, but at the same time, they made the system excessively complicated, slow, and difficult for beneficiaries. So, Philips, once again, question for you. Is this debate familiar in Latvia as well? And do policymakers and experts point to similar problems, or is the diagnosis different?
There are similarities, and we have also some specific cases that shows that. One of the recent case that illustrates this is that it's still going on. There was investigation from European Public Prosecutor's Office. They recently finished its investigation starting point about small city, Valka in Latvia. It's a border city with Estonia. And then there was a conclusion about misuse of funds. But according to the prosecution, the municipality falsely presented an industrial development project as open to any future investors, while in reality it had been designed for a specific company, enabling it to some money. And from one side, there is, of course, this institutional process right now, but in public's attitude, if you look to it's more like supportive to the regional city and the mayor of that city, as they try to do something good for a regional place to some economic boost. And instead, they got some technocratic answer and shut down that you haven't done everything correctly under the papers. So there is some internal conflict, maybe, of understanding how we can go on with this. But it is like one case. Maybe you can give some also shorter question add up, and I can give some brief.
Alexandra, do you also in Poland experience with misuse of EU funds, or are there any factors that hold the cohesion policy in Poland back?
Well, there certainly have been cases of misuse of EU funds, but in Poland, this is indeed a marginal phenomenon. It has been the case with the recovery funds that Poland has long waited to receive. There have been cases of money going to the people or organizations that should not necessarily receive them, but the corruption regarding the EU funds, as I said, this has not been a major problem in Poland. One factor for that is the funds being highly decentralized compared to many other EU countries. A big share of the funds is managed by regional governments, the regions, the voivodeships, as they are called in Poland, and the region actually design and run their own programs co-financed with the EU money. Yes, the central government still manages national level projects, but regions have a real decision-making power, which is good, I believe, because the regions know they need best. So they do not need to have others to tell them what do you really need as a region.
I also wanted to add up that I don't think that the case what I gave is something that is typical for Latvia, that region, misuse of funds. I just wanted to maybe show that we have those cases and that makes some kind of public opinion about practicality of this matter.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you for that point, because speaking from the Slovak perspective, the division of responsibilities in the management of EU funds has been one of the most debated issues. If we talk about weaknesses in implementation, many regional authorities and other stakeholders would argue that one of the biggest problems has been excessive centralization. Until recently, the entire process from launching calls for proposals and evaluating projects, approving funding applications and so on, was firmly controlled by national ministries. For years, regions have been calling for greater powers and greater trust from the state. Their argument, as you already said, their argument is that they understand local needs better, and the central government institutions are weaker in this sense, and therefore they are in a better position to decide where investments are most needed and where they can have the greatest impact. On the other hand, national politicians have long resisted decentralization, arguing that regional administrations lack the necessary administrative capacity and expertise to manage such a complex system effectively. A significant change only came in the current programming period when Slovakia finally introduced integrated territorial investment, which I think are very known in Poland, into its cohesion policy framework. In practice, this means that several important decision-making powers were transferred to the regional level. For example, part of the national allocation is now managed by newly established regional councils, composed of representatives from the respective territories, and altogether they are responsible for allocating roughly 1/4 of Slovak's cohesion policy resources, which is approximately 2 billion. But the national government and regional authorities have high expectations from EU, expected not only to accelerate the absorption of EU funds, but also to improve the effectiveness and relevance of investments. But so far, these expectations have not really materialized. Even after 3 years, very little of the funding managed by the regions has been translated into concrete projects. And one of the main reasons is that despite the decentralization reform, key powers remain in the hands of the national ministries. So as a result, what we are seeing is not full decentralization, but rather a partially completed reform. And that has created a new source of frustration among regional actors. So Felix, what is the setup in Latvia, and is the centralization even issue in EU funds or cohesion policy?
Maybe the size of Latvian or country is an aspect in this case. It can be the case the same what it is in Poland, for example, or even in Slovakia, as we are smaller. So it's very centralized. All the management of EU cohesion policy is highly centralized. Ministry of Finance serves as the managing authority, and while the sectoral ministries, they are responsible for policy planning and implementation. And then municipalities that are in divided in planning regions, they are mostly involved through the partnership principle. They help to identify investment needs, prepare and implement those projects. So the system, the administrative function, it is highly centralized in Latvian case. And given Latvia's, as I said, a relatively small size, and it is rational from the scope of resources, how we can organize this.
I definitely agree with you. And this is also what the upcoming debate on the future shape of reform cohesion policy will be about. It is already being discussed in the context of negotiations on the next multi-annual financial framework. The European Commission published its proposal last year, and it triggered quite heated and controversial reactions, as it would significantly reshape the structure of EU funding. One of the key changes is the merging of various EU funds and programs into a single so-called super fund. And among other things, this would strengthen the role of national governments in deciding how cohesion policy resources are allocated. And in Slovakia, this has led to disappointment, especially in the regions, which feel that their access to EU funds could depend almost entirely on the goodwill of the central government without any clear legal guarantees at the EU level. And at the same time, the proposal is not very popular among government politicians, particularly because of concerns about the overall size of the budget and the amount of funding allocated to cohesion policy and also the common agricultural policy. And in a way, it is somewhat paradoxical because despite long-standing calls for greater flexibility and subsidiarity in the planning and management of EU funds, which is exactly what the Commission's proposal aims to introduce, Slovak politicians are now quite critical of the new structure. They are reluctant to be the ones responsible for deciding how much goes to regions, how much goes to farmers, and how much goes to defense, because these are politically sensitive choices, and they know that public frustration would ultimately be directed at them rather than at Brussels, as it was until now. And another point of criticism is that under the new proposal, member states would also be required to link investments to reforms, similar to the Recovery and Resilience Facility. And this is despite the fact that Slovak governments have long called for EU funds and cohesion policy to be more performance-oriented. And there is a whole separate chapter, farmers, who are probably the most critical group of all. Perhaps there is a story for another podcast, the Cohesion. So it is fair to say that the European Commission's proposal has pleased very few people in Slovakia, if anyone at all. So, Alexandra, what is the reaction in Poland?
I would only say that same in Slovakia. Also in Poland, the proposal to merge several EU funds into a single centralized framework is received skeptically, and with, just like in Slovakia, the strongest concerns coming from regional governments. As I said, Poland has a very decentralized model cohesion policy, so regions feel that a shift towards a single fund would weaken their influence and reduce the ability to shape investment according to their own needs. And as you've just said, another major concern is this competition of priorities. So within new system, like the cohesion policy being merged with agriculture, with innovation, and even defense-related spending. So the regions tend to fear that more money would be put into defense and considerably fewer would go to regions, because we have a specific situation right now. We need to invest in defense, in safety, security, so that would be a priority, and the development of the regions, including infrastructure, schooling, and so on, would go to the background, would be less important. So these could dilute the original purpose of cohesion policy, according to skeptics. And but at the national level, the reaction is more mixed. There is some recognition that the current system is extremely complex and sometimes overly bureaucratic. So the idea of simplification itself is seems good. But on the other hand, there is some concern that this simplification could come at the cost of predictability and stability of the EU funding system.
Quite similar also, the proposal has also been received with caution. I also have said that there is broad support for simplifying EU funding and giving member states greater flexibility. That also reflects the case what I gave about that small city and the industrial complex what they built, and then afterwards there came some prosecution. So the simplicity is very demanded, but again, if there is some gray area at this point, then it is concerning. And what I saw from the discussions, then the main concern is that different sectors would have to compete for the same national envelope. As Latvian politicians and agricultural organizations, several times they have pointed out that this could mean that the investments in regional development, they could be more unclear how they are separated. But also, unlike in some larger member states, the debate in Latvia has focused less on this centralization aspect because the management of EU funds is already, we are centralized, as I said before. So it's not the centralization aspect, as more the unclear view. But I also thought that before a few years, I had the opportunity to interview Apostolos Tsitsikostas, that he was president of the European Committee of the Regions, and now he is European Commissioner. And one of his remarks has stayed with me since that interview. He argued that weakening cohesion policy would be a gift to a populist. And the more I follow European politics, the more I believe he was right, because people need to see the practical benefits, what they can get out of this policy, what we have. And this works out also after those changes of how we are planning our budget. So it doesn't impact that part. So from the Latvian point of view, so if the real practical life goes on and we can give support for farmers and continue to improve our school system and roads, then I think it's going to be all right.
It seems that despite different national experiences, reactions to the Commission's proposals are remarkably similar across many EU countries. From what you said, I think that fear from regions and farmers will be the key driver of the next discussions. This debate over the future of cohesion policy is clearly only beginning, and it will likely become one of the major political battles surrounding the next EU budget. We'll certainly continue following it closely. For now, I'd like to thank both of my colleagues, Alexandra Krzysztoszek and Philips Lastovskis, for joining us today. So thank you. And my name is Martin Koren, and thank you for listening EastFlank Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the EastFlank Podcast for future discussions.